I'm with the ladies from, should be here in a minute. Cool.
There we go. Well, hello, everybody. Welcome back. How's everybody doing? The first actual, like, real fall morning. I saw the frost and I'm like, maybe a sweatshirt or jacket. I'm like, I didn't want to admit that, but we're rolling through with it. So
That's what layers are for.
exactly.
So today is going to be another week of mostly listening to him because it's more military history. But next week we're going to get into some of the fun stuff about Alexander and he's young, and start thinking about who might have wanted to kill Philip and why. So
If you, yes, you've ever, I don't know, you guys might have seen the movie Shaun of the Dead with Simon Pegg, and he's supposed to be, it's a parody of zombie movies, but there's a part where it's like they're making this plan of how they're going to save his mom, and he's like, we're gonna, pick up my mom, we're gonna kill Phil, and then go to the Winchester. It's like, okay, let's kind of this predates that a little bit, we went through.
And Phil's her husband, not Sean's father. Anyway.
Yeah. So let's kind of hop back in. A little bit of a refresher. We were talking about Philip and Alexander's family as we go through. And we're finally going to be hitting a point where Philip is going to be acting as a regent for his infant nephew. And Macedonia is not in the best shape when Philip is finally sent from Thebes back to the kingdom. It's in basically the only direction it's not being invaded from is Greece itself. All of those neighboring tribes that we have been talking about, they take advantage of the fact that the sitting king was killed in battle and Philip hasn't come back in quite yet. So what Philip ends up doing, his brother is killed at the beginning of 359 BCE, and Philip is literally the only male relative of age left in his family, because his brother did have a child with his wife, but we're talking about this is a toddler, this is infant, so this is someone who is not able to take control of pretty much anything. With the death of the king, what ends up happening is you have a series of crises that break out. Okay, it was a war against the Illyrians. Okay, so these peoples right through here, they had invaded the western part of Macedonia. Philip's brother had marched to try to defeat them. Instead, he and most of the army are destroyed. Okay, they're ambushed in an area where it's heavily forested. There's a lot of hills that are around the area where he's ambushed in. Basically, what ended up happening was the Macedonian army was trying to ford a river, basically going across the river, and that's when the Illyrians end up hitting them. And so half of the army is on one side of the river, and the other half is in the middle of the river and on the other side. And so the people who are on the side of the river that the Illyrians are not attacking from, that's the part of the army that ends up surviving. There's only about 1,000 of them out of 6,000 that survive. The other 5,000 are hunted down as they're trying to retreat. Okay, so the Illyrians use this as an opportunity to basically push in, and they occupy a huge part of Western Macedonia, basically absorbing that territory because there's just no army, no king to actually go through and try to push them out for a while. The next crisis that is going through, okay, the tribe that's neighboring the Illyrians, okay, the Paeonians, they also, once the Macedonian king is dead, they decide that they're going to start rampaging through. They're not interested in really taking Macedonian territory. What they're doing, though, is they're basically going through and pillaging all of the towns and cities that they can. So burning them to the ground, taking any of the horses, the cattle, people, okay, as slaves, take them back. They're not really, again, not really interested in occupying the territory. They're just trying to cause as much damage as they can. Then to make it even better, there is a pretender to the throne. Once the legitimate king is dead in Macedon, and you have this infant, who is now king, you have someone who's part of the Macedonian army who says that he should be the legitimate king because he has a distant relation to the royal family. And so what ends up happening is the neighbors to the northeast, the Thracians, who don't really care for the Macedonians either, they decide to support the pretender because they're looking at it as if they help put this guy on the throne, there's a potential that they could get chunks of Eastern Macedonia as basically payment for them putting him there. And then there's another pretender. Yay! This time it's a Greek general, a diplomat who was coming from the city of Athens, who had been going to Macedonia to negotiate with the Macedonian king about one of these cities that's in the southern part of Macedonia along the coastline. This city is called Amphipolis. This was a city that the Athenians had originally founded back in the 500s. Okay, so about a century and a half before this. While Amphipolis is an independent city, it still has close ties to Athens. There are massive hardwood forests that are around that city. Those trees are basically the materials that the Athenians use to build their warships. So it's very important for the Athenians to keep that city under their thumb, and the Macedonians had started to encroach on that. And so when the king is dead, you have this guy named Argius, who is supposed to be, an ambassador. Instead, he also claims that he's a Macedonian king, even though he's not Macedonian. Isn't it wonderful how all these things happen? So Philip is released from Thebes, which is in this area right here, and he has to go through Thessaly in order to get to the capital and then find, all these barbarian invaders, two pretenders to the throne, and the potential that the Macedonian, nobility and just the cities that are, under threat from all the neighboring territories, maybe they defect to the enemies just, out of survival, versus being plundered. They're like, okay, you know what? We'll work with the Illyrians. We'll work with the Thracians, whoever can protect us. Now, in order to kind of really, the biggest threat that he has is the kingdom of Thrace, the one that's to the northeast, because that is actually a kingdom that is relatively organized like his own. There's a central king, there is a nobility that works with them, there's a fairly decent army, okay, that is going to be there. What ends up happening is this is where Philip starts to go into diplomatic mode instead of war mode. He knows he can't fight everybody at once. The biggest threat is going to be the Thracians. And so what he ends up doing is he goes through and puts together a diplomatic marriage. He is going to marry the daughter of the Thracian king. Okay, so the idea is that this is a dynastic marriage, that these two kingdoms are now, neutral with each other. The Thracians are not going to support one of those pretenders. So that means that, Philip can actually hunt this guy down and kill him. He's not interested in trying to negotiate with the pretender. He wants to get rid of him before he gets too much power. And so you have, what is going to end up happening, you have the son, Briseis, who's supposed to be leading the Thracian army. Philip meets him, starts talking with him, offers a bribe, and then ends up, marrying this woman named Adada. And this is Philip's first wife out of 7. We're not talking about one marriage ends and then he goes on there. He has 7 wives eventually at the same time. Because again, in this period, for nobility, it is not unusual for them to have multiple wives. They're all diplomatic marriages. It's not necessarily that they actually, he and his wives actually really love each other. It's not a, matchmaking, it's more along the lines of this is advantageous for the royal families of each side as they go through. Now, by doing this, it gets the Thracians off his back. And the interesting thing is that this king, Critias, and then his son, Briseides. There's not really any statues or busts that still exist of them from this time period, and we're not even really sure how much the Thracians really would have been into depicting their kings in art. This is actually from 2017, this statue. This is a modern artist's rendition of what he believed this king would have looked like. And then in the early 2000s, this king becomes a kind of Bulgarian folk hero, is where Thrace is, where Thrace was, is today's Bulgaria, southern Bulgaria. So he becomes kind of he predates the Bulgars coming into this area, but he becomes kind of this national hero after you have the collapse of the Soviet Union and the end of the Warsaw Pact. And so in the early 2000s, this is one of the stamps from the Bulgarian government that they end up putting out. So it's kind of this idea that, even modern governments, even in Europe, are kind of reaching back in time. And I mean, really far back in time in some regions in order to kind of claim, uh, let's put it, slight legitimacy to what had been the classical world. Okay, you see this also in the Middle East. It's kind of along a similar line. Saddam Hussein, when he took over Iraq in the late 70s through the 80s and 90s, he would have himself depicted as a Babylonian king, like you would see on the stone reliefs and the statuaries. So he had the robes that a Babylonian king would have. He was on a chariot. He's hunting lions, just like you'd see in these ancient, sculptures and statues. So it's kind of not unusual to do this, but we really have no idea what this guy would have looked like. We have no idea kind of what Thracians, again, are kind of these northern cousins to the Greeks. So they share the same gods, the same culture, rough Greek dialect. If you were from classical Greece itself, the city-states, you would look at the Thracians as another group of kind of semi-barbaric northern cousins. One of the things this marriage also does is it allows Philip to basically be able to move what's left of the Macedonian army away from the Thracian border so that he can concentrate on the Illyrians. And he could call on Thracians as mercenaries. Okay, so he's opened up a new avenue in order to get soldiers to supplement the Macedonian army. And for Philip, one of the things that is really advantageous for him is Macedonia has a lot of gold and silver mines. So he does have the ability to actually go through and mint coins in order to pay these mercenaries, where a lot of the other kind of areas in the Greek world have burned through most of that. So Philip has a huge advantage when it comes to that. The other thing that he ends up doing in terms of, at least getting rid of the other pretender so that he doesn't have to fight a civil war at the same time he's trying to expel, his barbarian neighbors from the north, is he reaches out to Athens and he knows that really the only reason why they're interested in supporting this pretender is to ensure the Macedonians don't conquer Amphipolis. And Philip basically sends the, diplomat there, and he says, I'm not interested in the city. And he goes so far as to pull the Macedonian military units away from that city because there had been small fortresses there kind of along the outskirts. He pulls that back and tells the Athenians he's not interested in it. And so what will end up happening is that this pretender, man named Argius, he ends up losing his biggest, outside supporter. The Athenians will still provide him with some money to hire mercenaries to try to fight the Macedonians. The Athenian army does not go itself. And what ends up happening is that when you have, okay, these troops here, the Macedonians, withdrawing, that kind of gives the idea that, this mercenary expedition of 3,000 troops gets to Amphipolis, and then instead of cooperating with the guy they're supposed to be working with, they just start rampaging instead. So, great times to go through. This is a depiction, okay, of an Athenian hoplite for this period. And this is a very wealthy Athenian who is going into combat as a hoplite because he actually has, okay, a bronze cuirass. So he's got a bronze plate that goes over his chest and his back. He has a bronze helmet. He also has full-length bronze greaves. And this is designed so that, when they're fighting in the phalanx, since the shield is only really going to cover this part of his body, everything from the knees to the ankles is vulnerable to spear thrusts. So having the bronze greaves at least gives them a chance to deflect, okay, one of the spear thrusts going through there. With most of the Greek city-states too, when it comes to kind of the illustration that is going to be on the shield front, a lot of it is personalized. And so you can have an image, like in this case, this is supposed to be an ogre going through there. You can have animals. You can have, images of gods and goddesses to try to protect you. The only Greek city-state that really had a uniform design on the shields for all their soldiers was Sparta. And that's because Sparta produced all the weapons and the equipment for their army. But beyond that, it's very personalized. And again, if you have the depiction of a god or goddess on the shield, you're hoping that they're going to protect you when you're in combat. So to kind of give you an idea of where kind of everything is at. Okay, here is Pella, which is the Macedonian capital. Here is Thebes, where Philip had been held until his brother was killed in combat. So it is a pretty significant, okay, distance to go from, being a hostage to being a regent to try to go through. You have the Illyrians in this area, Paeonians here, the Thracians to the east, and then this kind of little weird peninsula that juts out south of Macedon. This is another alliance of Greek city-states that are kind of opposed to every other Greek city-state and opposed to the Macedonians too. They're basically trying to be independent as they go through. But most of this territory has fallen to the Illyrians. The Paeonians are burning their way south towards Pella, the capital. The Thracians have been bought off. And then Amphipolis is right about here. Okay, kind of right along the coastline. It's the city, that city itself is actually at the mouth of the river that's emptying in to the sea at that point, and it's on an island. So it's really highly defensible. It's hard to get to that place if you can go through. There's a city that we're going to talk about, and I know this is not exactly the easiest map to read as we go through, but there's a city that's called Methone. That is going to be the site of Philip's first military victory as regent. And then later on, a decade later, that's where he's going to lose one of his eyes during a siege. It's hit in the face with an arrow. Now, this is actually a pretty good book. This is put out by a British publisher. It's called Pen and Sword. It's the Macedonian army of Philip II and Alexander the Great. It goes through talking about the history of what the Macedonian army looked like before Philip went through and did his reforms, and kind of lays out how he went through and integrated cavalry and the hoplites together, the use of siege engines. Again, Philip is really, really good at seeing the technology that others have developed and then using it in his army. The Macedonians are some of the best at siegecraft at this point in the world. Basically, most of the city-states in Greece and in the Near East have city walls. Okay, so they enclose the city and they have defensive towers within them. The Macedonians have a dedicated siege corps, meaning that there are, catapults, siege towers, covered battering rams that are, disassembled, but they go along with the army. And so if they run into a city that's fortified, the Macedonians surround the city and then they start putting these weapons together and then they pound the walls until they collapse. Okay. Uh, Philip borrows a lot from what the Greek city-states do, and then he improves upon it. And I'll show you some of the stuff, some of the weapons that he uses, because it is pretty impressive. Okay. Now, when these, Athenian mercenaries show up, their general decides not to leave. He stays at Amphipolis. And the guy that he's supporting, Argius, he takes those mercenaries by himself, and instead of marching on Pella, the Macedonian capital, he goes to the second most important city, which is Aegea, which is the old capital. He's hoping that the people in the old capital city will declare him as Macedonian king. And he is sadly disappointed because he gets there and they won't even let him in the city. They close the gates and they basically have him sit outside until he finally gives up and decides to start marching back. And while he is, he and this mercenary army are on their way back, Philip ambushes them. And he ends up capturing Argius and he executes them. He does manage to kill about 1,000 of the Athenian hoplites. He takes the other 2,000 prisoner. But instead of keeping them as slaves, they to work, in the mines, he ends up reaching out to Athens and commutes them, basically saying, you can have them back. Okay, the pretender is dead. Amphipolis is, still under Athenian influence. As long as Athens swears that it is not going to send, more mercenaries or try to support a future, imposter to the throne, Macedonia and Athens will be in a period of peace. So he's managed to stabilize the east and the west of Macedonia within a year, which is pretty good. Now, a lot of the things we hear about with Philip early on in his regency and eventually what will be his reign, he's coming from a Greek historian who's writing a couple centuries later. His name is Diodorus. He goes through the process of, that's kind of the hard thing when it comes to these ancient historians and ancient writers. A lot of times they're writing minimally decades, sometimes centuries after an event has taken place. And so they're taking liberties. So they, swell up the number of enemy soldiers that, the person they're giving the biography to is fighting to make it look more of a spectacular victory. Sometimes they're hearing things, second, third, fourth hand, or they're using sources that no longer exist to us as they go through here. But one thing that Diodorus did as a historian was he tried to do a complete history of the classical world. So he starts, he has multiple volumes that he is writing. And when it comes to Alexander and Philip, it's like, what would you say, Christy, 3/4 of the way through his books, or is it halfway through? Doesn't he have like 24 volumes or something like that?
Yeah, it's about halfway.
Yeah.
I have to look specifically.
And even with Diodorus, his books that he wrote, a lot of those are lost too, or they're fragmentary. So we don't really have too much to it. But with Diodorus, he's really kind of the person who is giving us most of the information that we have on Philip. So that's kind of the hard part. It's not, you can't really say it's 100% reliable source, but it's really the only one we have. So you got to take some of the stuff he says with a grain of salt. Some of the things though that he talks about are accurate. This is the first victory what's left of the Macedonian army has after they were butchered by the Illyrians and losing their king. So this is the first time they're able to go into combat again and actually defeat an enemy army. So this boosts their morale a lot. Plus, any of the, the wealth that those mercenaries had, the Macedonians take as war prize. So that's another way that they can get paid as they go through there. Okay, the other thing is that it also, for the Macedonian soldiers, for them, it proves that there is a competent commander. Okay, because Philip, has been outside of Macedonia for years by this point in time. So most Macedonians, they know who he is. They know he's a member of the royal family. They know he's going to be regent, but they really have never had much in terms of contact with them. And one of the things that they realize with Philip is that he's aggressive and he's creative when it comes to fighting. Okay, and if there's a situation where it does not look, very good for the Macedonians, Philip will withdraw to fight a different day. Okay, he's able to read kind of what the battlefield is looking like. If it, whoever he's going to be fighting against, if the battlefield looks more advantageous to them or the Macedonian army is tired from marching, Philip gives them time to rest. He's looking for ways to ensure that he can, survive. And again, Philip is, for as brilliant as he is in combat, he's also an incredibly brilliant political animal. He knows how to play the games. He knows how to play the city-states off of each other. He knows that Macedonia is really has always been a kind of ally or tributary, vassal to the city-state of Thebes. Thebes and Athens are enemies. So, he wants to ensure that Athens is not going to threaten Macedonia while he's going after the Illyrians. So he plays down Macedonia's alliance with Thebes. And this is why he gives the Athenians their soldiers back. Because usually, if you're going to have slaves in the ancient world, they're prisoners of war or they're criminals. In this case, Philip is, he's making the gesture to the Athenians that I'm not interested in the city that is near my border that you want to protect. To prove that, I'm giving you back the soldiers that we captured from there. Just don't have them come back. Don't fight again. It actually is kind of a brilliant tactic. And, for Athens, they can't afford to lose too many of their soldiers because they still need to protect their city-state and central Greece against Thebes and Sparta. So this is a really good move for, Philip. He's taking Athens off the board. He's basically saying, go for it. And kind of the interesting thing is too, on a different note, when it comes to, what Diodorus looks like, uh, this is a depiction of him from, I want to say this was from 1739. There's really no busts of him. There's no statues of him, at least none that are existent as we go through. If you look up Diodorus in Google to try to see if there's an image show, they always attach images to the people he did the biographies for. So Philip, Alexander, a number of different ones, but never actually one for him, which is kind of crazy.
Okay.
Yes, exactly. A lot of the stuff, yeah, again, a lot of these things are lost over time. Especially if they're in, these major cities that are damaged by earthquakes or damaged by war. A lot of that stuff, or looting for that matter, a lot of the stuff just disappears over time. Now, he goes after, okay, the third of his enemies. He's neutralized the Thracians, he's neutralized the Athenians, so no more pretenders, there's no more threat of civil war. Now he's going after the third party, those Paeonians, okay, the ones who are just basically burning the northern part of Macedonia. In this case, what ends up happening is Philip gathers together more soldiers and he goes out in the process of attacking them as they're trying to withdraw. And again, he does not really want to get into a major battle with them because the Macedonian army is still small at this point. Most of the professional troops were killed with his brother. And so he's trying to hit these people as they are withdrawing back into their own territory. For the Paeonians, they too believe that they are part of the Greek world. And the Greeks do not believe that. They have this, again, they worship the same gods and goddesses. They have the same mythology. They have a kind of rough, dialect of Greek that they're working with. In this case, this is kind of cool. The Peonians are actually, by this point in time, they're semi-organized into their own kingdom. They're actually going through and producing their own silver and bronze coins. And this is one of the surviving examples of this. And this is what's kind of cool, with this expanded Greek world, even if the Greeks don't accept everybody else that's around them, the others want to be part of that world. Okay, and in this case, this is a Peonian coin. And instead of having, a depiction of a tribal leader or their king at the time, it is taken directly from Greek mythology. This is Hercules killing the Nemean lion. Okay, one of the, in Greek mythology, Hercules has these tasks that he needs to complete. One of them is killing this lion whose hide is basically invulnerable. So what he ends up doing is he strangles it to death, wrestling with it. And then when he's done, in order to show that he's killed this thing, he skins it, and then that's his cape and his hat. The lion's skull sits on his head, so he's got the mane and then the rest of the body as his cape. These Peonians, when they're trying to set up their state, they use that myth that they've heard and that they've incorporated in their own culture as a way to try to integrate themselves into ancient Greece. And even the Macedonians don't accept them. But again, depending how far north you go, even if you're on the edge of the world, even the people who are slightly, more civilized in quotes will still reject you as you go through. 358 BCE, Philip finds out that the Peonian king ends up dying of old age. Doesn't die in combat, isn't assassinated, he just ends up dying. And the son that comes in is relatively untested. Okay. And so what ends up happening is while there's this transfer of power, this is when Philip takes the Macedonian army and goes into Peonian territory and basically subjugates them. He ends up making them a tributary state for Macedonia. So again, it's this kingdom to the north of Macedonia is semi-independent. It has its own kind of rulers that are there, but they're subservient to whatever Philip wants. So if Philip demands that they give him tribute, they have to give him tribute. If he asks for men or supplies, they have to supply that. And he does it this way so that he doesn't have to garrison it. He basically defeats the son of the dead king and allows him to remain king of these people so long as he will follow what Philip tells him. So Philip is securing his northern border. Again, it's this instance where it's warfare and diplomacy playing out at the same time. And again, Philip is looking at it as the dangerous threat are the Illyrians, because they're the ones who killed his brother, destroyed most of the army, and then have occupied something like 40% of the kingdom. So he's trying to save as much of his army as possible so he can deal with them. And Philip is going to go through this process. The first few years he's back in Macedonia, he's not king. He's taking care of the political and military situation for a baby, for his nephew. But he's realizing that it's going to take years and years for this kid to hit the age of majority when he can take over. And Philip is building up the reputation among the nobility and the military that he knows what he's doing. And so if he decides to usurp the throne, he basically pushes his nephew out of the way. The majority of people in Macedon will not care. They will go on his side. So we're looking at this map. Philip has managed to go through and basically secure his southern border, his eastern border with Thrace. He's conquered these Peonians. And now he's going to go after the Illyrians. He's finally going to get revenge for his brother being killed. And even the cities, okay, these small areas that are along the, the contested border from what had been Macedonia and where the Illyrians are at, a lot of the Macedonians who are there prefer to be either independent or work with the Illyrians. They don't like the dynasty that's ruling out Apella. They don't like Philip's family. And so he has to do political maneuvering so he doesn't have to fight other Macedonians in order to make sure that he's going to be, successful with this. Okay. And what he ends up doing is he starts pulling in mercenaries from Thrace. Okay, so he's buying soldiers to supplement his army. He's calling in, okay, those tributary soldiers from Paeonia, and he is going to start marching, okay, to go into this area where those disloyal cities and bring them back into line. Okay? And again, it's kind of this instance where this can go really bad for Philip if he's not careful of where he ends up marching, because this area is mostly mountains, hills, forests, and fast-moving rivers. So this is really a difficult place if you're an invader to try to go in and successfully fight and win a battle. So he has to be really careful when it comes to scouting where he's going to end up fighting with this. And he gathers a very significant force at this point in time. He has 10,000 infantry and then 600 cavalry. So this is a very large army for this period in time. That mercenary force that went against him before was only 3,000 and it was considered large. So Philip is this is his big gamut to try to go through and crush the Illyrians in one campaign season, basically. Now, this is what a Macedonian heavy cavalryman would have looked like, okay, during Philip and Alexander's time. You'll notice there's no saddle, there's no stirrups. Basically, you have the bridle and bit, and then your legs to hold you on top of that animal as you're going through there. And it would take, a lot of times what ends up happening with the cavalry in the ancient world, the horse and the rider basically are with each other for years and years and years in order to develop almost an instinctual bond so that when they go into combat, the animal understands what it is that the rider wants. And we've all seen, the movies where you have, these cavalry charges where the horses just start going towards a line of men and then crashing. Horses aren't stupid. They're not going to do that. It takes years to get a war horse properly trained. And a lot of the times you're not charging towards, a solid shield wall that's in front of you because you're going to kill the horse and probably you're going to kill yourself. You're trying to hit the side, the flank, or you're trying to get behind an enemy to go through. And when it comes to the armor too, there is no armor like you'd see on a knight in medieval times with cavalry at this point. The best you're going to see is either going to be hardened leather, okay, that's still flexible and kind of light, or, a couple centuries from here, you're going to start to see chainmail being incorporated on the horse. The rider himself, the only armor he really has are going to be his greaves and his helmet. And then again, if he's very wealthy or he's part of the Macedonian aristocracy, he might have a bronze or iron chestplate in order to protect himself. His primary weapon, okay, is a shortened version of that pike. So that sarissa that I was talking about that Philip is going to introduce is like 18 feet long. Theirs is only 12 feet long. But it's basically used like a lance. And once it breaks, they're using axes, maces, or swords in order to fight. Another thing that the Macedonians will do is sometimes with, their heavy cavalry, they'll have another rider on that horse. So there's two people. And what ends up happening is as, the horses are trotting towards the enemy line, the second rider is basically like a light infantry. So they don't have armor. They're either throwing javelins or they're slingers, so they're, they have a leather thong and they're throwing stones or copper bullets, basically. And that's something that's devastating about the Macedonian cavalry is that they have infantry to help back them up and protect them. And a lot of times it's Macedonian cavalry that wins the battles. Because the infantry kind of block the enemy in place, and then the cavalry breaks through somewhere and then starts attacking from behind. Also, it's in this case, this is one of the really super wealthy, okay, Macedonian cavalrymen. These are what are called the companions. So these are the nobility of the Macedonians. You can tell that because instead of just having a saddle blanket, he has a leopard skin. And the only way you get that leopard skin is by killing the animal yourself in a hunt. Okay, again, it's that idea that they're proving their prowess, okay, before they go in there. So Philip ends up gathering, okay, his 10,000 infantry, his 600 cavalry, and then he takes some of the siege engines that he builds. And these are not, catapults. These are basically like giant bolt throwers. So think of them like giant crossbows that are going to be on kind of a wooden platform with wheels, so you kind of put them in there, and an arrow that's as long as a table. Okay, in order to punch through lines of infantry or clear off the walls of an enemy city. Philip is taking the siege equipment with him to fight a regular battle because he's going to use that as artillery to weaken the Illyrian lines, which you don't do at this point in history. Okay? He ends up marrying the second wife at this point because one of those Macedonian territories that he has to kind of bring back in, that is right on the border with the Illyrians, they're famed for their cavalry. So he ends up marrying the daughter of the guy who's ruling that city. And so he's able to supplement even more cavalry into his army and deny it to the Illyrians. Okay, and again, for all the wives that Philip has, he only produces a couple sons and a few daughters. He's got 7 wives. Most of the time he's on campaign, most of his life. And the women stay back at the capital. What ends up happening is that the Illyrians find out that Philip has gathered this huge army and is starting to march into their territory. So the Illyrian king makes this offer. He says, the Illyrians and Macedonians can be friends with each other as long as you allow us to keep the territory that we've taken from the Macedonians. Philip is like, no. I don't want you inside Macedonian territory at all. And quite frankly, I want to kill some members of your royal family because you killed my brother. And so he rejects it out of hand. And Philip is already starting to march. He's already assembled this army. He's got all of the supplies that he needs. And this Illyrian ambassador is coming to him while Philip's army is on the move. The Illyrians have not started calling up their people yet. And so the Illyrians are kind of in this bad situation where they're like, okay, we have a competent enemy, a much bigger army under his command that's coming through, and everyone else that we could rely on as allies or to distract him are already gone. So the Illyrians are kind of in this position where it's like, oh, this is great. And again, it's Diodorus who goes through and gives the description, the history of this earliest battle. And again, who's the only source we have for this. There were sources probably that he used from before, but this is the only thing that's still, in existence that we can kind of use with it. And he talks about this that, again, Philip kind of chooses where he wants to fight. For his army, he relatively flat terrain, unbroken by trees or hills, because the core of his army is infantry. The core of his army is that phalanx where you have that shield wall, all those guys standing shoulder to shoulder. It is an awesome weapon to use if your soldiers are on level ground and all they have to do is march straight. And I'm not even joking about it. Because the phalanx is incredibly difficult to maneuver once it starts, because it's just this straight line that can go for a mile or a mile and a half long, depending on how big the army is. It's very difficult for a phalanx to be able to adjust or readjust as it's starting to fight. And so, again, Philip finds a spot that's advantageous to him. He's got the phalanx lined up. He has his cavalry on both sides of that phalanx. And then he has his siege equipment on the hills that are behind him. So that those bolt throwers can fire into the enemy as the Macedonians are advancing. And they don't have to worry about getting hit. The phalanx moves up again at walking pace. Is again, you don't charge. It's not two lines of people charging towards each other because you're going to wear yourself out as you go through there. The phalanx is basically, think of it like rugby, where you have the two teams pushing into each other, except there's no ball in phalanx warfare. But the idea is that you're using the strength of everybody in that phalanx to bull the other side backwards. So you go at a slow pace because if you start to charge, you're going to wear yourself out. Or worse, you break the phalanx, break the line. The cavalry goes up slowly beside the phalanx, okay, to make sure that they're not going to get attacked on either side. And then when the battle's engaged, the cavalry usually disengage and then they swing wide and try to get in behind the enemy. Now, this battle is one that it is, and again, in a lot of the ancient battles, you're not talking about them being all day long, from sunrise to sunset. Usually they're only a few hours long because you are going to get worn out in the process of this. So according to Diodorus, when the armies approached each other and with a great outcry clashed in the battle, Philip, commanding the right wing, and so the right-hand side in the Macedonian infantry, it's not unusual for that to be the most important side. This is where you put your most experienced veteran troops, is on the right. The other side is going to do the same thing. And so what you're trying to do is you're trying to destroy or turn the left flank of the other phalanx line. Philip is going to command the infantry. He's going to have people that he can trust commanding the cavalry, okay, while this is going on. And it's not unusual for your commanders in, ancient battles to be injured or killed on the battlefield and no one to realize that until after it's over. Or if news of a commander being killed is announced, okay, or starts to spread, that's usually when an army breaks. Because they're looking at it as, okay, we don't have anybody who's commanding us anymore. That's when they start to fall back. That's when most of your casualties take place, when the lines break. Okay? And so this right wing, which consisted of the flower of the Macedonians serving under him, ordered his cavalry to ride past the flanks of the barbarians and attack them on the flank, while he himself, falling on the enemy in a frontal assault, began a bitter combat. So this is where Philip is developing his idea of hammer and anvil. The infantry is the anvil. It stops the enemy and holds them in place. Macedonian cavalry is the hammer. It is still maneuvering and it is trying to get behind the enemy army so that they hit them from two different directions. This is something that Philip is going to develop. Alexander is going to perfect. Okay, Alexander would not have had the successes during his Persian campaigns that he did if it were not for Philip's reforms and his generals. Because most of Alexander's early campaigns, it's Philip's tactics and his generals who are controlling the battlefield, okay, while this is going on. But the Illyrians, forming themselves into a square, courageously entered the fray. Okay, so what that means is that the Illyrians know that the Macedonians have cavalry. So instead of having all their soldiers face in one direction, the Illyrians basically form their lines into a box. So they have 4 different lines that are supporting, all facing outwards, to try to stop the Macedonian cavalry from overrunning them. So again, the Illyrians know what tactics are too, so they're barbarians according to the Macedonians, but they've had enough contact with the Greek world to know this is something that is going to happen, and they have a way to defeat it. Okay? At first, for a long while, the battle was evenly poised because of the exceeding gallantry displayed on both sides. And as many were slain and still more wounded, the fortune of the battle vacillated first one way or the other, being constantly swayed by the valorous deeds of their combatants. Again, you want to see in this period your leaders fighting in personal combat. You want to see that right wing, you want to see these champions, you want to see your king fighting and being able to overcome whoever they're fighting against. As people are, killed or injured in ancient warfare, it's not just, again, one single line of soldiers fighting each other. You have ranks. As soon as someone is killed or is injured, another person steps into their place. And you do have periodic breaks in the fighting where you have a chance to kind of rest and reset your lines if you can. But what will end up happening is later, as the horsemen pressed on from the flank and rear, and Philip, with the flower of his troops, fought with true heroism. Of course, because again, Diodorus is giving this biography of how awesome Philip is. So Philip is the key point of the entire Macedonian army. Again, very similar to what you get in any ancient account. It's always the general or the king who's the one killing thousands of the enemy, and the rest of the army is just kind of standing like, wow, he's so cool. I love this guy. The mass of the Illyrians was compelled to take hasty flight, and in this case, the Illyrians finally break, and Philip is not in the mood for mercy. He ends up ordering the cavalry to basically ride down and kill as many of the Illyrians as possible, so that they cannot, regroup. And while the cavalry is out chasing down the Illyrian fugitives, Philip and the infantry basically they stop where they're at. They start collecting the injured because there are field hospitals basically set up to try to save as many of the injured as they can. And while medicine back then is not as advanced as it is now, if the wound is not too horrific, it's not unusual for a soldier to recover from being hit with a spear or an arrow. I mean, for God's sakes, Philip loses his right eye during a siege, and it shatters his eye socket, and he's back up in a few weeks, which is amazing. Philip ends up, gathering his wounded, having some of them treated, and then he takes a good chunk of what's left of the healthy men in the army, and he starts going towards the Illyrian capital because he is trying to catch them where they're, not able to defend themselves as they go through. According to the battle, again, with Diodorus, you have this Macedonian army of about, almost 11,000 men. Diodorus estimates that 7,000 Illyrians are killed in this battle, in this pursuit, which would have been a large number of their fighting men. Because again, these are not, the Illyrians don't have, cities where you have 10 or 20 or 30,000 people. A lot of it is small villages or small towns. So this is a significant number of their men being killed in the process of this. Now, once the Illyrians, are defeated, because they're still fighting in Macedonian territory, technically, when this battle takes place. The Illyrians are pushed back over their border, and Philip follows them. They sue for peace. And initially, he's kind of chasing them and, again, harrying them, trying to kill as many as he can. One of the things that kind of helps him along that way is, a kingdom, another of these northern kingdoms that is semi-barbaric according to the Greeks. This kingdom of Epirus also hates the Illyrians. And when they see that Philip has driven them out of Macedonia, the Epirites basically offer to go to war on the side of the Macedonians to wipe the Illyrians out. Doesn't happen. The Illyrians stick around. There's still a problem way into the Roman Republic. But this is a moment where they're cowed. They've been beaten so badly that kind of this whole area, of northern Greece is pacified. And that's going to give Philip a major advantage as they come through. Okay. It hits a point where Philip is really the last man standing in this area. Everyone who was a pretender to the throne, everyone who had occupied Macedonian territory has been expelled. It's just him and his nephew. Okay. And it's really kind of interesting because, again, there's not really a record as to what happens to this kid. Because after Philip has stabilized everything, and he's got the loyalty of the army, he's got the loyalty of most of the Macedonian nobility, he crowns himself. And, usually if you do that, you take the throne from the legitimate ruler, you execute the person. There's no records that he did this with his nephew. So it's entirely again, he's still an infant at this point. This little kid has no idea who he is or what he's supposed to be. So Philip takes over the Macedonian throne, and for all intents and purposes, this kid probably was one of the people who was an administrator for Philip without even knowing it, of what was going on. Let's take a quick break. We'll come back at about 10:35, and then we'll kind of talk about how Philip is consolidating his hold in the territory.
Is that Albania now, or
Mhm.
the Greens are?
Yeah. And like where ancient Macedonia used to be, half of it is northern Greece now, and then it's called North Macedonia now. And
Right.
Yeah, so it's.
Cause I'm like, is there a South Macedonia? And they're like, no, there's no
Nope.
South, just
And
North.
even with, North Macedonia, that had been part of Yugoslavia before that collapsed. And so it's. The 20s, let's put it this way, after Alexander the Great, this whole area is not very kind to the Macedonians.
Right.
We're here. We know very good.
Oh, okay, well, it's on the top, yeah. Side shoot. All right, cool.
I think that is what it is.
It's just amazing to me how things change so much from when it was called this, now it's this,
Mhm.
something else, and
I have that a lot with Eastern Europe. I'm like, well, it used to be this, and then it became this, and now it's back to this. But it's not all the same area.
so Yugoslavia like no longer exists.
Nope. Yeah, it was created after the end of the First World War by combining Serbia and Bosnia and a bunch of the Slavic territories in that region to make what was termed the Slavic superstate. The idea is that putting Yugoslavia together was supposed to calm tensions in that region. Did not calm tensions at all. Because
tried to do that though, right?
yeah, Tito after World War II tries to do that. In World War II, the Germans occupied Yugoslavia, and then they use the existing religious and ethnic tensions that are there to try to control the area. And instead, Yugoslavia just becomes this massive civil war and guerrilla war against the Germans. The Germans have to station 30 divisions in Yugoslavia from 1941 onwards. It's a big chunk, a good chunk set of their army. Tito was one of the communist partisans who eventually is going to help expel the Germans. And then he goes after, they really were pro-Nazi resistance groups that were in there. And when the World War II was over, to try to make sure that the country didn't continue the Civil War, Tito basically said, it doesn't matter what you think you are, you're Yugoslavs before you're anything else. And the country stabilized until he died. And then it started to pull apart again. And that's when you had the Yugoslav wars and then Serbian and Bosnian wars, the war in Kosovo, the war in Croatia, the war in Northern Macedonia. Yeah, so that whole area just becomes a huge, well, it really is a huge bloodbath from the late 90s into the early 2000s. Yeah.
But it seems to just go right back to this time. It seems like this is almost where it started.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
amazing.
and that's the thing, with in the 1800s, in Europe, you start to get romanticism. The idea where you're looking, you have people from a different ethnic or nationalist group looking back to the past to explain where their people came from. A lot of times they're grasping at these ancient cultures that they probably really don't have any real, attachment with. But it's especially true in Southeastern Europe because this area was controlled by the Ottomans, the Turks, since the 1300s up to the 1900s, so almost 600 years, where a lot of these identities have been kind of officially erased as independent territories. So, that's why the Bulgarians and the, Albanians are grabbing these ancient, Thracian and Illyrian kings and being like, yeah, these are the people that we're coming from. It's like, I don't know about that.
So, is there really any evidence that they're genetically different? Or is it just that some live in cities on the coast and some were, it lived
Yeah.
in the hills?
A lot of it is, just regional breakups, regional, more along the lines of regional differences in culture and languages, and then eventually just kind of, well, to a degree, evolving into their own separate groups.
And
but-
did Macedonia have a population advantage over these hill people?
Yeah, yeah,
So-
the Macedonians are, because a lot of their area is
So
flat plains.
we give the king credit for being a good strategist, but when you have a lot of people for your army,
Yeah,
Yeah.
Yes.
it's different than if you just, and you got the horses that don't live in the hills.
Yeah.
I mean, they
yeah, well,
can't,
yeah, that's a huge point too, because for the people who are living in those hilly areas, the ground that can be cultivated, it's either people or animals, and they're gonna choose people to do that. And in the hills, there are small, plots for farms, but not the same thing like where you have large flat plains.
not unlike West Virginia.
The hill country, again, that's how the Greeks were looking at, the people further north too. They're like, oh, it's these hillbillies again, causing trouble.
Well, I'm not putting down West Virginia.
No, I'm
They
not-
just have this geographical.
Yeah, just the way that's, Yeah.
I don't know, millstone around their
Yeah.
necks.
Yeah, and
Because
like West
yeah.
Virginia, a lot of, when it comes to farming, a lot of it is subsistence farming. It's to keep themselves fed, but not really grow enough to trade for anything else. And so that's kind of that symbiosis between the cities and the hills is that, the cities are able to produce more food, they can produce goods. A lot of times, the people who are in the hills are the ones who are bringing in, the animals, or they're providing mercenaries. Because there's kind of there's this perception that when you have sedentary settlements, you have the large cities, the people there are softer, they're less warlike. The people who are still in the hills, kind of in the wild areas, because they have to hunt in order to provide more meat. They raid in order to protect the resources that they have. They're more warlike. And so you want them as allies, or you want to hire them as mercenaries instead of having them as enemies. So yeah, it's interesting. It really is. And that's something that goes back to the rise of agriculture, the idea of, which version of society is better, the civilization, the cities, or the people out in the wilds.
I was just gonna make a comment as far as, are they different genetically or whatever, but linguistically, they tended to speak different languages, and by that alone, they already start to separate out, right?
Yeah.
But
And that's part of it too, is that, where some of them are, in the Greek peninsula itself, you have what is, defined as Western culture, you have the city-states, the massive temples, you have the theaters, you have organized government. And that's, Greece did not invent that. Okay, no matter what any Western historian says, all that stuff comes from further east, from earlier civilizations that the Greeks borrow. That's what's happening with a lot of these societies that are developing further north. They are their own entities. But over the time, by being on the periphery of these great societies, they want that stuff too. Now, that's one of the things that, later historians, when they're talking about the classical world, a lot of stuff that they miss is that the barbarians don't want to tear down civilization. The barbarians want to be part of civilization. They want to have the same things that the Romans or the Greeks have, because it doesn't make sense to destroy all of that in a rampage of, 30, 40 years and then have nothing afterwards. They don't want to destroy the world. They want to be incorporated in it. That's the same thing that's happening with these peoples. They do have their own languages. They will borrow a lot of language and culture from the bigger culture that's, again, the bigger empires that they're around. And so again, for Macedonia in this period, especially with Philip, he is basically trying to force the Greek world into accepting the fact that Macedonians are Greek. Okay, we're not barbarians, we're cousins of you, but we had, again, same culture, same religion, same language, same, we're trying to build the same cities that you have on a larger scale, better scale. But he's looking at it as, we've been the shield for the Greek peninsula for centuries. It's time you start to actually accept that we're part of this and give us an equal footing in it. The Macedonians were not allowed to participate in the Olympics. Another thing, the Macedonians were not allowed to join any Greek alliance system, even though they wanted to. And their allies, or, goes back and forth between allies and vassals of Thebes. Macedonians are looking at it as, we should be able to exercise some sort of, political authority or economic authority on an equal footing as everybody else. Philip's going to force that. By the time Philip, does seize the throne of Macedonia, the Greek city-states in the south have worn themselves out by infighting. The Macedonians are the only real, Greek culture that is strong enough to, in quotes again, unify the rest of the Greek world, because they have the men, they have the money, and they have a leader who is going to push to have that end up happening. Now, in order to go through and, make sure that the districts that he's just reabsorbed back under, his control, Philip is going to go through and basically reorganize how the Macedonian country is going to be set up. He's breaking up those older kind of political principalities, where you had a tribal leader who's loyal to Pella or a gay. He's going through and he's looking at, okay, if these men are going to administer this area, there needs to be a way to basically control them. And Philip is going to do what the Greeks did to the Macedonian royal family. If you want to administer this area, then your sons do not stay with you. They come to Pella as a group, and they are educated with my sons and the sons of my generals. The idea is that they're not necessarily labeled as hostages, but it's a way to make sure that the father follows what the king wants. And it also puts together what's going to be called the companion system. These are, these men are going to be roughly the same age. They are going to be educated by the same tutors. They're going to get the same type of education as they go through. There's going to be, military training, physical training, mental training, in order to get these guys to basically go into their adulthood understanding that this is the king, this is the heir to the throne, these are the people that we follow. Okay, and a lot of these companions are going to be generals or administrators once the Macedonian army becomes bigger. Okay, and so it's the idea that, these guys over the course of time, are not going to identify, to these small regions they came from. They recognize the authority of Philip. They recognize the authority of Philip and whoever his successor is going to be. So that when, Philip eventually dies, they don't turn on the successor. Okay, they're going to be basically, trained into it. Okay. And this is going to allow Philip to go through the process of expanding the Macedonian army even more. He's basically putting together an officer corps. Okay, a group of men who know military tactics and strategy, who will understand what they need to do on a battlefield in order to support each other, or in some cases, to operate independently of the main army. Okay, that's going to be a hallmark again of the Macedonian army, is that they can break away particular units and have them operate by themselves, and then link up with the main army again somewhere further down the line, weeks or months later, and having secured whatever objective they needed to. Okay. Now, in this case, this cavalryman, okay, this is another one of the companions, okay, companion cavalry. These are going to be the men who are going into battle alongside Alexander the Great. Okay, he has a group of bodyguards. These are the men he's grown up with. Okay, and these are the shot cavalry of the ancient world. As they go through. Again, they're operating with, okay, those lances. They have a heavy straight sword that's designed more for slashing than it is for cutting or stabbing it. This is designed so that when they're riding, they could just swing down and they have the whole edge of the blade to basically hit a person as they come through.
So is it on the back? I mean,
Where would they keep the sword?
Yeah.
Usually they have a belt that they're gonna have, and then there's and then it hangs off one side of them.
Also, the proportions are all, I mean, the soldier is bigger than the horse.
Yes, that actually was the case.
Really?
Yes.
So
You go-
horses
yeah.
are bigger.
Most of the ancient world's horses are smaller than what they would be in modern times. Because they didn't, I mean, they're going through the process of selective breeding, but it's not like a Clydesdale. Okay, like a Clydesdale is like an offshoot of what would be a medieval war horse. The bigger the horse is, the quicker it's going to wear out from running and from carrying this person. And so again, depending on where you're at, the smaller horses have better endurance. Okay, especially when the best horses you get in the ancient world don't come from Greece, they don't come from Rome, they don't come from Egypt, they come from Central Asia. Because that's where you have the nomads, the Scythians, who are breeding these horses because that's how they do their farming, because they're pastoral nomads. They herd things, and that's also their primary way of fighting. So for the Macedonians, they buy horses or they steal horses from surrounding territories in order to basically have the group through there. And again, with the horses, a lot of times the cavalry is not involved from the very beginning of the battle. They're kind of guarding the flanks of the Macedonian army. And then when they see there's a breakthrough or they get the command, then they have them start to move around as they go through. But yeah, they're a lot smaller.
And where would they put their maces?
Hmm?
You said they also.
Again, they have it on a belt. You don't have a, yeah, that's the thing. It's like you don't have a sword or anything that can cross your back because it's incredibly difficult to actually pull out. So you have it on your side. And usually, depending on what hand is dominant, you have it on the opposite side. So that because otherwise you're going to be fumbling with it to try to pull it out on your dominant hand side. And again, in this case, the only thing that's really metal that he's going to have is his helmet. Everything else is going to be really thick, okay, cloth that has been glued or laminated together. So it's this sheets of cloth that are laid out And then you put glue on top of them, and glue is basically, animal tendons, hair, fat, melts it together with some other things. You put another layer of fabric on top of that, and then you just keep putting layers on that until it's about, maybe half an inch to an inch thick. And that'll help deflect some, arrows, sword thrust, well, not really sword thrust, but cuts and things like that. Um, the helmet again is either going to be bronze or iron. The Macedonians use iron more than they do bronze. Bronze is, it's a composite metal made out of tin and copper, and usually something else in order to mix together. Tin is rather rare in this area of the world. Iron is a lot more plentiful, and by this point in time, we actually hit a point where iron is easier to work with, and so that's what you're going to use with it. So you have these companion cavalry. The right wing of the Macedonian army, where the king is going to fight, those are what are called foot companions. So they are other members of this group that are basically the bodyguards for the king if he's fighting on foot. As they get ready to fight, Philip expands the Macedonian army, well, much larger than anything that the previous Macedonian kings had done, because there are no more rivals to the throne. And just the material wealth, okay, those gold and silver mines that he controls allows him to basically put together this professional army and keep them under arms almost all the time. For the Greek city-states further south, those are men who, volunteer for a season of war at a time. So they're trained in war, but they're looking at it as we'll fight over the course of the summer and then return home when there's the fall harvest, and then we go fight again until next spring or summer.
Is the cape for warmth or?
It's a little bit
Capes
for
are
warmth,
bad.
but again, it's more along the lines to give protection a little bit. As you're going through it, you have that, it's kind of moving around. It might, the cape might block a spear thrust, might block, an arrow that is coming in. And the other thing with, Alexander and Philip is that they're not afraid to use long range weapons. In the Greek world, it was viewed as cowardly to, if you were a man, to be a slinger or be an archer if you had the money to be a hoplite. Philip and Alexander are looking at it as, you know what, it's kind of nice to be able to kill people from far away. So what they would do is they would hire mercenaries from the islands, in the Aegean Sea, because they didn't have a lot of hoplite warfare on there, but they had a lot of slingers and they had a lot of archers who were really good at hitting targets. And like slings, when you think of throwing stones, in the Greek world, it wasn't a stone. It was either an iron or it was a, copper bullet, literally a piece of, metal about like that could, fracture your skull from 150 yards out. And the slingers that they're using are very accurate. Headshots were not unusual. And there are, instances where there are these sling stones that actually have Greek lettering on them. Basically, asking for the gods to help with the aim, or saying that someone sent this in your direction. So, I mean, they had a sense of humor, I'll give them that.
They also wouldn't necessarily wear the capes into combat.
Mhm.
That's something that you have while you're traveling. It protects you from rain, it protects you from,
And if you're doing a parade,
Leather.
it's also another way to show wealth.
yeah.
Because one of the things that's on there with a lot of the companions is they have, a lot of their, clothing has some area where there's going to be purple on it, because purple is associated with royalty. And since these men are part of the nobility and the bodyguards of the king, that's a sign of honor that they're able to do that.
Just one comment about the size of the horses.
Mhm.
If you don't have stirrups, you can't get on a big horse.
Yeah.
You gotta grab the mane and swing your leg over, probably why the horse is moving.
And the horse is like, watch this. Yeah, and usually too, if you have cavalry, it's not, the rider doesn't just have one horse. A lot of times they have two or three in order to kind of rotate them out. And a war horse is not going to be ridden when you're on march. That horse is going to be walked by a groom so that you don't wear out its hooves and you don't wear it out as you're going through. Because again, a horse does, they do have a limited endurance as they go through.
Were they shoed? I don't think
I
so.
don't think so at this point in time, because there's still, at this point, they're still moving an area where the hose would be ground down, where you really wouldn't have to do the, because you don't have asphalt roads or anything. It's either stone or dirt. And so there's,
I don't think European horses were shod until well into the medieval age.
Yeah, but they might have had like boots that they put on them if they needed to, according to.
Yeah, for loose stones
Yeah.
or shit.
but yeah, so it's just, again, in the way that the horse really responds to the rider, it's not necessarily the bridle. It's, squeezing the legs together in a particular way. So the horse is like, okay, we gotta go right, or we gotta go left, or we gotta pick up the pace and get moving. Because a lot of the times, the cavalryman is also fighting with a shield. So he has he's holding on to the rein with the shield arm, but if you have to move, eventually you have to let go of the reins, and hope that the animal is going to respond to what you want to do. And Alexander he really loved his horse Bucephalus, not in a weird way, but not like Caligula. No, Alexander and Bucephalus, he supposedly Bucephalus was a horse that couldn't be broken by anybody else. And Alexander did. And Alexander has this horse from before he becomes a Macedonian king until they go all the way into, northern India. And the horse Bucephalus finally dies of exhaustion just because he's moved 11,000 miles. I can't blame the animal. And it's interesting because when Alexander is conquering different areas, he founds a lot of Alexandrias. So like the most famous one we have now in this world is Alexandria in Egypt. That's the first one that he founds, but he founds like almost 100 other ones throughout the entirety of the Near East and Central Asia.
A lot of Philippines.
A lot of Philippines. There's one Bucephalus town that he names where the horse dies. I'm like,
And is buried.
yeah, and it's buried. It's like that's nice. Yeah, I'm glad the horse got recognized compared to all the other people on this campaign that didn't. And then in order to further secure, the alliance with that kingdom of Epirus, Philip's going to take another wife. This is going to be Alexander's mother. She is Olympias. She is the niece of the king, Vitali. This basically ensures that these two kingdoms, just like Macedonia and Thrace, are secured by marriage alliance. They will not turn on each other if one of the three goes to war with someone else. They'll stay neutral, or better yet, they go in on the side of their in-laws to try to help them. And again, when it comes to the story for Olympias, Chris is going to have more about her next week.
Yeah, and that's.
But a lot of the information we're getting is coming from after this period. And she's really painted as scheming.
She's a powerful woman in a man's world.
Yes. Yes, she knew how to protect herself in the court. She knew how to operate within the court. She basically, when Alexander is fighting in the east, she's basically the one who's controlling Macedonia and Greece itself for him. So a lot of the time, afterward, yes.
One that poisons a couple people to get rid of them, and that, I think we
Yeah.
touched on that last year. I don't know if it was guys, but somebody.
Yeah.
She
Yeah,
may have.
She is credited with killing Philip's last wife. And their children, although there's some question, because the last wife had a boy and a girl. And it's quite possible that Alexander killed the boy personally. But Olympias definitely killed the wife and the daughter. So, yeah, because that was why. I'll get into this next week, but that was one of the reasons probably why Philip was killed. was because Olympias and Alexander their position had been usurped.
Threatened. Even though Alexander
Yeah, potentially.
is an adult at that point in time for all intents and purposes, that this new wife has a boy
And she does.
she does, and Philip, because that's the thing, when, yes, he has all of these wives at the same time, but when you get a new wife, that's the one that he's gonna be most interested in. And so that threatens the succession for Alexander, because Olympias and Philip were known for having very vehement arguments.
Yeah, there's, the other thing is that Olympias was, as you're talking about, she's an Epirite, and the last wife, that Cleopatra Eurydice, is Macedonian. And so the Macedonian is always going to take precedence. And there's a whole thing about how her uncle just goes on and on at a party about how she's going to give Philip a legitimate heir. And Alexander's there and he gets into a fight with the guy, and Philip doesn't defend his son, and there's a good story to it also.
Yeah, Philip and Alexander don't really get along either, so
So
this whole,
succession, like,
The succession's a
or anything, it's.
cluster. Yeah, it's a mess. There's no idea of primogeniture. His first son is sick. And that's another thing too. Like, there's Olympias is either his fourth or fifth wife. We don't know, because the first son, who is sick, who can't inherit, is born just like maybe a couple months ahead of Alexander, but we don't know like where the marriages fall in, you know?
again, it's
Because his mother is a dancer, I think. So she's less wife and more concubine, even though they call her wife. Yeah, again,
yeah, and that's the thing, the line of succession can change depending on what the father's attitude was towards the son.
Mm-hmm.
So for Alexander, once he hits the age of majority, this new wife and new kid are a dire threat. Dun dun dun. So now, the next thing that Philip is gonna do, that one city he told Athens that he's not interested in. He's interested in it. What a surprise.
We'll bet.
Yeah. So what ends up happening is he's looking at, okay, that city of Amphipolis, which again, it's right along the coast. It is on basically there's a river that ends up emptying into the sea. Amphipolis is built on the island that's kind of like in the delta, the biggest island that's there. Amphipolis is actually, it's a very large city at that point in time. It's got a series of walls to protect it. It has temples that could basically, rival anything that's in mainland Greece. It started out as a small colony for Athens, and because of where it sits in that river, it has access to, the wealth of the sea. It also has access to these really incredible forests that are important for building Greek warships and merchant ships. Plus, it's kind of close to some areas that have gold mines. So it's really it's able to basically outgrow that idea of this, kind of small outflung colony city very quickly. It's able to grow pretty extensively. And so Philip is looking at it, and he's looking at Amphipolis, which is kind of downstream from where Pella, his capital, is at. He's looking at it as well. I can't have this city be independent, and I can't have it be an ally to Athens. So I need to absorb it. And this is a thing in the Greek world. They make treaties with each other where they promise they're not going to fight each other for 30, 40 years, and then it usually breaks down in 3. Yeah, but since Philip had been able to go through and just, basically expel any and destroy any of the threats that he had, now he could finally turn on this city and concentrate on going after Athens, basically pushing them out of this area. So to go through this, it's 357. So this is only 2 years after Philip has come back to Macedonia. He's secured everything inside the territory. He's, rebuilt the confidence of the Macedonians. Now he's expanded it. And these are some of the siege weapons that he was going to use and that Alexander will use in their campaigns. This is that bolt thrower I was talking about. Okay, this is basically going to be disassembled and taken aboard wagons when the army is moving on campaign. And then also, and then if there's a siege, you have the army surround the enemy city and start building what are called earthworks. So basically, they're digging trenches around the city to make sure that no one can get out of the city and no one can get into the city to relieve it. And you put these, okay, crossbows up basically in order to kill the defenders that are on the walls. And again, these arrows are, 4 or 5 feet long, iron tipped. Okay, and they'd have dozens of these set up. Not only do they have them set up like stationary in positions, there would also be siege towers. So these giant wooden towers that are on wheels that have different levels that will have 3 or 4 levels worth of these bolt throwers on them. And then at the bottom level, you generally have a battering ram. So, basically a tree that's been cut down, and then you put either an iron cap or spike on it, and then you have basically the siege tower protects everybody who's attacking that wall. You have those, ballista clearing off the defenses on the wall. You have the battering ram basically hitting at ground level to destroy the walls as they go through. Now, in this case, this is just a battering ram that has been covered up. So you'll have a wheeled, structure. You have, these wooden beams that go across from the top. The battering ram is held on by chains or ropes. And then these logs are basically there to ensure that the people who are pushing the battering ram up against the wall and then operating the ram are not hit by stones or arrows or hot, it doesn't work that great against hot oil or hot sand, but it provides a level of protection while they are going through and trying to knock the walls down. Philip and Alexander are the ones who create and expand that Macedonian siege corps. And their use of these weapons is going to, basically prove that, especially when it comes to the torsion, arrow throwers and rock throwers, they're going to prove that they can take down city walls if they're there long enough. And so you're going to have all of the generals who basically split Alexander's army up, using them against each other. And then the Romans are going to adopt them too. Okay, so they do. This is a period again. Philip is looking at warfare as if he has to take a city, he doesn't necessarily want to completely tear the walls down, because after he captures the city, then he has to rebuild them. But he does want to cause the maximum amount of casualties for the defenders. And generally, too, before they bring up these siege engines, Philip or Alexander will send envoys to the cities and basically say, look, we've surrounded the city, we're cut off from outside aid. If you surrender now, you generally, the local ruler still stays there, because Alexander and Philip are really specific about that. The idea is that if they can keep the local governor or whatever in the region and they'll be loyal to them, they'll leave them, because they look at it as these people already know the countryside. They know who the people that they're ruling are. They know what we can get in terms of taxes. So they're looking at it as, if we don't have to upset the governing balance, so to speak, if you're loyal, you stay there. And your city is also protected from looting for the most part. If the city surrenders, a lot of times what will happen is the civilian population leaves the city for a certain number of days, and the conquering army goes in and they take what they want, and then they leave the city intact. If the city resists, then the city is subject to what is called sacking. Basically, the soldiers, once they take the city, they can rape, they can burn, they can loot, they can do whatever they want, because they've taken that city and everything is now a prize of war. Sometimes you have cities that are not given the option of surrender and they are sacked to scare all the surrounding ones into submission. And Alexander is going to have one siege in particular that is horrifically brutal, that lasts months and months and months. That's the siege of a city called Tyre. Tyre is on the east coast of the Mediterranean, basically where modern day Lebanon is now. The Tyre that he's going to besiege is on an island that's a mile offshore. And initially it refuses to become part of Alexander's empire. They say basically they just want to be neutral. Alexander won't take that. And so Alexander literally rips apart the old city of Tyre, which is the ruins on the coast, to build a mile-long pier in order to besiege the new city. And then he levels it after he captures it and kills the men and sells the women and children off as slaves. So it's kind of an instance where you don't mess around with Alexander. He does not take it very well.
Oh, is it Beirut?
Nope, it's to the south of Beirut. Beirut actually is a very ancient capital. It is a very ancient city, though, that was around at that time. So what will end up happening is, he starts going after Amphipolis in 357. The next year, Athens is like, oh, you broke the treaty. The Athenians start sending out requests to the Thracians, the Illyrians, the Paeonians, all the people that Philip had just crushed 3 years ago, asking if they want to go into alliance against Philip. And they're like, I don't think that's a good idea. Like, he's a lot closer than you are to us. Philip finds out, though, that these discussions are taking place. And so instead of letting them, these people either say yes or no on their own, Philip leaves part of the army to besiege Amphipolis and then takes the rest and then marches into those other territories and defeats each one of them. Well, he doesn't really have to fight any battles against those three people. He just basically crosses their border and goes to the capital and be like, you really want to be on the side of the Athenians? And they're like, no. And so they wisely end up sitting down and kind of being quiet with it. It's at that siege, when this is going on, Philip is besieging another city. And while he's reviewing the siege works, he is hit in the right eye by an arrow. It actually doesn't like hit straight on. It hits from an angle. And so what it does is it hits the top of his, eye and then goes through the eye and then out the bottom of his eye, his eye socket. And it's like, while he's recovering from that, he's still at the siege. And then, after the surgeons kind of go through and like, well, the eye is ruined, so they do the best they can to patch it up to make sure it doesn't get infected. He ends up going through and continues commanding the siege. He's only out of action for like 2 days and then comes back in. And then the even crazier thing, in order to, get the garrison to surrender after he loses his eye, he basically tells the people of the city, that if they surrender, he'll allow them to leave without being enslaved or slaughtered. And they take the deal. And so he takes the city with the walls pretty much still intact, and he puts in a Macedonian garrison and a Macedonian civilian population. I don't know how well I would have handled working with, trying to come up with a way to take the city where I lost my eye. But that's the thing, again, where Philip is mercurial too. He can be really gregarious, he can be peaceful, but at this point, one of the other things that the Greeks kind of don't like about the Macedonians is in ancient Greece, if you're drinking wine, you water the wine down in the city states so that it's not as alcoholic and it doesn't affect you as much. With the Macedonians, they do drinking parties, but they don't water the wine down. So they get drunk and they lose control very often. It's not unusual for Macedonian drinking parties to break out into fistfights or break out where someone is killed because somebody gets pissed off and then goes out and gets their sword and stabs the other person coming back in. Philip is, again, that's kind of the thing that, as Alexander gets older, there are parts of his father that he admires, but there's a lot of things about his father that he doesn't like. And one of the things that he doesn't like is, when Philip has these parties, that's when he starts going after Olympias. That's when he starts complaining that she's a barbarian. Her husband is complaining that she's not Macedonian. She's not, her country is not good enough. And he doesn't defend Alexander when there's these fights, when things break out. Alexander also has these parties. Alexander is also going to go through the process of killing people who protect him in combat because he gets drunk. It's this weird, again, it's this mercurial, attitude they both have towards each other. Sometimes they like each other. Sometimes they hate each other. And you have that one last major argument where Philip doesn't defend, Olympias and Alexander. And that's kind of getting the ball rolling where Alexander and Olympias, maybe they are the ones who are going to be responsible for what happens to Philip. We don't know. Now, by the time we get to 354 and 353 BCE, Philip is pretty much, again, dominated all of his neighbors that are around him. He's broken that, the attempt by the Athenians to get them all to ally against him. And Philip is now looking at it as, all right, now I am going to take Amphipolis, and I'm never giving it back to the Athenians, and I'm going to keep pushing south. Because if Athens thinks that it can prevent, Macedonian expansion, they're wrong. Philip does have a significant advantage in population. Everybody who's in Macedonia is loyal to him. Athens, it's the city-state in the surrounding countryside that they can pull from. That's it. So Philip has a pretty good advantage. Another thing that ends up happening too is that there's that one league of Greek city-states that really kind of did not want to be involved with Athens or Thebes or Sparta or even Macedonia. Philip manages to secure a treaty with them that Macedonia, okay, and Callicarnisse are friendly towards each other. So that neutralizes a threat to the southeast. So now Philip can basically kind of concentrate on moving towards Greece itself if he wants to. And this is a reconstruction. Again, kind of a reconstruction of what we believe Philip looked like after losing the eye. And part of the reason why it's hard to reconstruct what he would have looked like is that for the Macedonians and the Greeks, cremation was practiced when it came to funerals. So a lot of times you don't have the skull or the skeleton to go through and do the reconstruction for it. There are a lot of busts of Philip before and after he loses his eye, though. This is actually in a reconstruction. It's not really said, thank God. Not anybody else said for that matter. This is a reconstruction that is going to be put in the Macedonian Royal Museum because where his royal family, where Philip, his wives, his sons are buried, they're in an area that's between Pella and Aegae, basically a hillside that they dig into in order to make these tombs. In the last 15 years, archaeologists have identified that they did find Philip's tomb. We didn't find Alexander's because Alexander is not in that area. It really, as these battles are taking place, the Macedonian army is getting more and more confident, better trained, and it is hardened to war. Again, the idea is that these guys are ready to go to war at a moment's notice if they need to. And so to kind of give you an idea of what the Macedonian army is going to look like under Philip and Alexander, this is kind of how it's going to be organized. You have, okay, that Macedonian phalanx that is going to be the center of the army. You have what are called hypaspes. These are elite heavy infantry. They are basically more heavily armored than the regular Macedonian phalanx is going to be. but they have a shorter spear. They're designed basically when the phalanx pins an enemy in position, the hypaspis is supposed to work its way around the enemy's flank and try to get in behind them. You have, okay, infantry skirmishers. So these are your slingers, your javelin throwers, your archers that are going to be ahead of the main army. Basically, what the skirmishers are supposed to do is they're scouting for the enemy. And then when they run into an enemy formation, they're trying to break it up. Okay, so they're trying to cause casualties before the rest of the army comes in. You have, okay, the heavy cavalry, okay, the companion cavalry, usually on the right, okay, formed up into squadrons. You have these guys that are called peltasants. These are the guys who are sometimes the second rider on the Macedonian cavalry. These are guys who have almost no armor. They have short swords. They have short spears and javelins that they're going to throw. Again, they're kind of an elite skirmisher that's going to go in it. And then you have behind them allied infantry. Okay, so these are the people who are either mercenaries or they're tributary soldiers for the Macedonian army. They basically are on the battlefield, but they don't go into combat unless it's absolutely necessary. They're usually guarding the Macedonian camp. So when the Macedonian army goes to war and it's getting ready to fight, they basically build like a wooden fortress that their tents and their animals and the people are going to be inside to protect them. The Allied infantry usually protect that. The Macedonians generally don't call them into combat unless they really need to, because these guys do not have those long sarissas. They have basically the old style hoplite equipment, and so they're really not that useful to them. You have another group of heavy cavalry that's going to be on the left flank. Okay, the Thessalians. These are another, group of people that are between Macedon and mainland Greece. A lot of flat plains in this place. Thessalians are excellent cavalrymen. The Greeks would hire them as mercenaries, so did the Macedonians. Then you have light cavalry that's a little bit ahead. And again, these guys are there to skirmish with the enemy. If they have cavalry, Macedonian light cavalry pins them down. And then the heavy cavalry kind of thunders in and finishes them off as they go through. Later on, as Alexander kind of runs into more types of fighting units that the Persians are going to use, eventually he's going to adapt this kind of direction of attack to defeat things like war elephants. The Persians have elephants that they've traded with Indian kingdoms. They're basically like mobile fortresses, literally mobile fortresses. Elephant is going to have a mahout, a rider that sits on its neck that basically guides where the animal is going to go. And then there's a small tower built on the elephant's back. And the Persians either have archers or they have men with basically long spears or lances that they try to break up the Macedonian infantry. One thing that Alexander finds out relatively quickly, Greek horse and Macedonian horses don't like the smell of elephants. They panic them. Literally, they panic them. And so the Macedonian phalanx has to fight, a 2 or 3 ton animal with spears to try to break the elephants. As they will go through. Now, in order for Philip to be able to extend his influence in Greece, he interferes with what is technically a conflict between 2 different alliance systems in Greece itself. You have Thebes, okay, which again is an ally of Macedonia. You have Athens, okay, which is going to be an ally of a group of people in this region who are enemies of Thebes. Basically, what ends up happening is this is a local disagreement over who owes who money. And then it turns into a Greek kind of world war as they go through there. And the reason that this is it's called the Third Sacred War. The reason it is called that is because you have this religious center called Delphi. Sarah, we kind of talked about that last week. Delphi is an area that has temples that you would send envoys to in order to have the priests there basically kind of tell you what the future is going to be. Okay, you're going there for prophecy. Well, Delphi is open to anyone in the Greek world to be able to do that, and it's supposed to be kind of neutral ground. Hey, nobody's really, no city state is really supposed to fight to control this region. Delphi is going to be the center of why this war starts. Okay, or what happens to Delphi because of that. Okay, you had this group of people who are called the Phocians. Okay, they are a group of people that are kind of spread through this whole area. They are one confederation, so all these different cities kind of cooperate with each other in order to protect each other. They are hostile to the city of Thebes, and in return, the kingdom of Macedonia. Well, Thebes controls its own coalition of cities, and it wants the Phocians to basically pay fine. They want them to pay for some damage that had been caused, and the Phocians refuse to do that. And what they end up doing is the Phocians start gathering their militia and their army, and they start marching on Thebes' allies. And one of the places the Phocians end up stopping is Delphi. And instead of just going through and passing through the area, they occupy it. Okay, and then they say that they refuse to leave. Okay, and that if anybody tries to go in and expel them, they'll destroy the temple. This is one of the most important religious centers in the Greek world. So what ends up happening is the Thebans start calling on their allies in mainland Greece to expel, the invaders. And then Philip's like, I just happen to have an army that could help get rid of these people too. And so he starts marching out of Macedon, going through Thessaly, on his way to Delphi. The Athenians and Spartans find out this is happening. Normally, these two cities don't like each other, but they really don't like Thebes, and they don't like the Macedonians. So they start gathering their armies, and everybody is marching in to central Greece to start fighting against each other. The Thebans really don't want Philip to come further south because they're afraid that if he goes into that area, even though he's their ally, he's probably not going to leave. Because everywhere he's gone up to this point in time, he's like, oh, this used to be something else, but now it's Macedonia. Thebes is afraid of that. Athens is afraid of that. Sparta is afraid of that. What ends up happening is that Philip kind of assembles his army and he starts marching south, and then he stops. He lets the Greek city-states wear each other out. He lets them burn up their military power by killing each other. Okay, and he will, his army will fight a couple really significant battles. But for the most part, this Third Sacred War, Philip is just kind of sitting on the outside. He's involved in it because his army is there, but he does not want to kill his soldiers because he's looking at it as if the Greeks wear themselves out, and he's correct in this, Macedonia will be the strongest entity left, and I'll be the one who can force the peace settlement. So he lets them just basically go through and rampage against each other in central Greece, killing off their army, destroying their navies, destroying the fields that feed those cities, and letting plagues break out. Again, Philip is a master at this. He knows that if he just lets them, the Greeks do the work against each other, he just has to come and pick up the pieces, and he is going to be able to do that. Okay? The one major battle that he is going to fight against the Phocians in order to push them out of Delphi is at this place that's called, and this is an area that we really can't identify exactly where this is at. Again, Diodorus gives us where this, what this battle is supposed to be, but he does not narrow down where it actually takes place. It's something called the Crocus Field. It's somewhere north of Delphi. It's in Phocian territory, so it's, you know, it's, Philip still has not made it into Greece proper. But the Macedonian army crushes the Phocians and pushes them out of there, and then liberates Delphi. And Philip evacuates the army out of there. He's like, "You can't loot this. This temple is off limits. This is why we went to war. Leave these people alone. Leave these weird priests alone, and the women seers who are there, and basically fall back a little bit and just let everybody know that we are here." You have an Athenian who actually sees what is going on, who realizes that if the war continues and the Greeks just keep grinding themselves down, Philip is going to be able to invade, basically unopposed. This man's name is Philocrates. He is talking to the Athenian assembly. Okay, so the Athenian assembly is basically every male citizen who can vote in the city. And they vote to decide, you know, what the major issues are going to be. In 348, he's like, look, we need to send a delegation to Philip and basically get a ceasefire with him. Because Athens and our allies are really not strong enough to expel him if he decides to get into Greece itself. It's better to direct him north or east, okay, than have him come into Greece. What ends up happening is when the Athenian assembly hears this, they reject it out of hand, and then they bring Philocrates up as a traitor. So he is under threat of either being expelled from the city for, you know, usually like being ostracized or expelled from the city is a 10-year sentence. Or he could be executed for this. Okay, luckily what ends up happening is that, you know, when this, you know, they're contemplating this trial, they realize how close Philip is. And they think is like, you know what, maybe that's not a bad idea. Okay, Philocrates, you get to be one of the diplomats that's going to go to Philip's camp and basically beg for him to turn around and leave. The thing that really gets the ball in motion is Philip's army is outside Pass of Thermopylae. This is really the last natural defense going, you know, from the Balkans into northern Greece. This is where the Spartans, okay, and their allies held the Persians off in the Second Persian War for a little while. If Philip can take this pass and hold it, which he's entirely capable of doing, then all of Greece is under threat. This is the thing that is going to push the Athenians to ask Philip for a ceasefire. Okay? And so what happens is you have Philocrates, the guy who originally offered this peace treaty, or talked about a peace treaty, and was almost exiled or executed for it. You have a really very eloquent and popular, basically another politician who never really rises to leader of Athens, but he's able to persuade a lot of people. His name is Demosthenes. This is a statue of him. Okay, and then you have Aeschines. These three guys are put together as the Athenian embassy, and they're sent north to basically make sure that Philip is not going to invade. And we are out of time. So I will stop at this moment and leave you on a knife's edge with tension. And then I'll finish the 2 slides that I have, and then I'll give it over to Kirsty after that.
They must have had really good artisans to make a statue like that.
Yes. And a lot of times with the, you know, the statues, it's a technique that we do